A story of pop culture warfare. In the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest where Hitler launched his desperate final gamble, American GIs discovered that sometimes the best weapon against enemy infiltrators isn't a rifle or a code, it's knowing who plays second base for the Yankees. This is the true story of how Mickey Mouse, baseball statistics, and the capital of Illinois became the unlikely tools that dismantled the Third Reich's most audacious commando operation. December 16, 1944, 3:47 a.m., a checkpoint outside Malmedy, Belgium. The Jeep's headlights cut through the pre-dawn darkness like searchlights, and Private First Class Eddie Kowalski felt his finger tighten on the trigger of his M1 Garand before his mind had fully processed what he was seeing. 3 men in American uniforms, the right patches, the right helmets, even the right mud splattered across their olive drab wool, the kind that only came from crawling through Belgian ditches in December. But something was wrong. Kowalski couldn't name it. Not yet. It lived somewhere beneath language, in the part of his brain that had kept his ancestors alive on Chicago's South Side, the instinct that whispered danger before reason could explain why. The driver's smile was too perfect. The passenger's hands rested too still on his Thompson submachine gun. And the man in back, the one with the tech sergeant stripes, held his cigarette between his thumb and forefinger, European style, like Kowalski's Polish grandmother. "Hold it right there," Kowalski called out, his breath crystallizing in the 17-degree air. Behind him, Corporal Jimmy Southpaw Patterson scrambled from the sandbagged emplacement, his own rifle finding its target with the muscle memory of 1,000 hours of training. The driver killed the engine. In the sudden silence, Kowalski could hear his own heartbeat, the distant rumble of artillery from the east, where the German offensive was tearing through American lines like a knife through paper, and something else, a quality of breathing from the men in the Jeep that seemed too controlled, too measured. "Password," Kowalski demanded. "Lafayette," the driver responded immediately, his English flawless, his accent pure Midwest flatlands. "Countersign. We are here. Perfect. Textbook perfect." Which was precisely what made Kowalski's scalp prickle with warning. He'd been in Belgium for 4 months now, long enough to know that real American soldiers never got the password that perfect. Real Americans mumbled it, fumbled it, sometimes forgot it entirely, and had to be reminded by an annoyed MP before being waved through with a curse and a warning. "Where you boys headed?" Kowalski asked, buying time, his mind racing. "Checkpoint Charlie, 7 clicks northwest," the tech sergeant answered smoothly. "Got orders to report to Battalion HQ. We're already late, Private, so if you could—" "Who won the World Series?" The question came from Southpaw Patterson, who'd stepped forward into the headlight beam, his rifle trained on the driver's chest. For a moment, nobody moved. The tech sergeant's eyes flickered, just for an instant, with something that might have been confusion or calculation. "The World Series?" the sergeant repeated slowly. "Yeah, you know, baseball, America's pastime. Who won?" Patterson's voice had gone cold, professional. His family ran a general store in Tuscaloosa, and he'd been selling baseball cards since he was 7 years old. He knew every statistic, every player, every game of the 1944 season the way some men knew Scripture. The driver opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "The Yankees?" he tried, his confidence cracking like ice on a pond. Wrong. Patterson's rifle didn't waver. It was the Cardinals. Beat the Browns 4-2. The St. Louis Cardinals versus the St. Louis Browns, the only all-St. Louis World Series in history. Now, you want to tell me what unit you're really from? Or do I need to ask about Betty Grable's legs? The Jeep exploded into motion, a desperate suicidal lunge forward as the driver gunned the engine. Kowalski's rifle spoke first, the crack of the Garand splitting the frozen air, followed immediately by Patterson's weapon, and then the thunder of the water-cooled Browning that Sergeant Marcus Stone had mounted in the emplacement. The Jeep swerved, crashed into a snowbank, And in the sudden stillness that followed, 3 of Hitler's elite commandos lay dead or dying in American uniforms, their perfect English suddenly useless, their stolen identification tags marking them as something they could never truly be. American, 6 days earlier, December 10th, 1944, Grafenwohr Training Area, Germany. Otto Skorzeny stood before his assembled commandos like a prophet addressing his disciples, and in a sense, that's exactly what he was. 6 feet 4 inches of scarred Viennese muscle, the man Hitler himself had called the most dangerous man in Europe, the commando who had snatched Mussolini from an Italian mountaintop and made the impossible look routine. When Skorzeny spoke, officers who outranked him listened. When he planned, the Führer approved. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the frozen training ground where 150 men stood at attention, "we are going to win the war." It was an audacious statement for December of 1944, when every rational German officer knew the Reich was dying. But Skorzeny dealt in audacity the way other men dealt in routine. Around him stood the elite of the elite, soldiers who spoke English so perfectly they could distinguish between a Boston accent and one from Baltimore, men who'd been pulled from prisoner of war camps where they'd spent years absorbing American slang and mannerisms, former merchant sailors who'd visited New York and Chicago, even a handful of German Americans who'd returned to the fatherland before the war. Operation Wacht am Rhein, what the Allies will come to call the Battle of the Bulge, begins in 6 days, Skorzeny continued. 25 divisions, 200,000 men, the largest German offensive since 1940. Our goal, to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Americans and British to sue for peace. He paused, letting the magnitude sink in. Every man present knew this was Germany's last roll of the dice. Every man also knew that conventional military power wouldn't be enough. The Americans had too many tanks, too many planes, too much of everything, which was why they were here. "Your mission," Skorzeny said, his disfigured face slashed by 3 dueling scars that gave him a permanently predatory expression, splitting into something that might have been a smile, "is to make them afraid of their own shadows." Over the next hour, he laid out Operation Greif with the precision of a master jeweler setting a diamond. They would have captured American jeeps, dozens of them, taken from motor pools and ambushed convoys. They would wear genuine American uniforms stripped from corpses and prisoners. They would carry authentic American weapons, smoke American cigarettes, eat American rations. Most importantly, they would be American. "You will operate in teams of 3 to 5 men," Skorzeny explained, walking among the assembled commandos. "Your objectives are simple but critical. Change road signs to send Allied units in the wrong directions, cut telephone wires, spread false rumors about German positions. If you encounter a fuel dump, destroy it. If you see a general's jeep, ambush it. Above all, create chaos. Make them trust nothing, believe no one, suspect everyone." He stopped in front of Oberleutnant Gunther Schultz, a former merchant marine officer who'd spent 3 years working on freighters between Hamburg and New York before the war. Schultz could order a sandwich in a Brooklyn diner and sound like he'd grown up 6 blocks from Ebbetsfield. "Schultz, what's the capital of New York?" "Albany, sir." "And the Yankees' home stadium?" "Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, sir. 161st Street and River Avenue." "Who's on first base?" Without hesitation, Nick Etten. Bats left, throws right, batting .263 this season. Skorzeny nodded with satisfaction. This was the level of detail that would keep his men alive. They'd spent months preparing, watching American newsreels, studying maps of American cities they'd never visited, memorizing the rosters of baseball teams they'd never seen play. They'd practiced American gestures, the casual wave, the 2-fingered salute, the way GIs lit cigarettes in the wind. They'd learned to chew gum constantly, to slouch instead of standing at attention, to complain about everything from the weather to the food to their officers. They'd learned, in short, to become what they were about to destroy. "Remember," Skorzeny concluded, "passwords can be captured, documents can be forged, but culture, Culture is what will keep you alive. The Americans trust their own. By the time they realize you're not one of them, we'll have driven our panzers all the way to Antwerp. The commandos dispersed to their final preparations, and Skorzeny allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. On paper, the plan was flawless. His men were the best. Their English was perfect. Their equipment was genuine. What could possibly go wrong? He would find out soon enough. December 17th, 1944. Allied Supreme Headquarters, Versailles. The conference room at Schaeff hummed with controlled panic, the kind that happens when professional soldiers realize they've been caught with their pants down. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at the head of the table, his normally pleasant face set in grim lines as intelligence officers laid out the scope of the German offensive. They hit us with 25 divisions along an 85-mile front, Colonel Edward Monk Dixon said, jabbing at the map with a pointer. Complete surprise. Weather grounded our air support. They've pushed 15 miles into our lines in some places. It's chaos out there. But that wasn't what bothered Eisenhower most. He'd fought Germans before. He understood military offensives, even brilliant ones. What he didn't understand was the reports flooding in from the front lines about American soldiers who weren't American at all. "Tell me about these infiltrators," he said quietly. Dixon shuffled through his papers. "We've confirmed at least 3 teams operating behind our lines, sir. Possibly more. They're in our uniforms, driving our vehicles, speaking perfect English. 2 days ago, they switched road signs outside Poteau and sent an entire armored company the wrong direction, straight into a German ambush. Yesterday, they cut communications at a critical junction, leaving 2 battalions without contact for 8 hours. This morning, 1 team was stopped at a checkpoint near Malmedy, but only because—" he paused, looking up with an expression caught between confusion and grudging admiration. "Because they couldn't answer a question about baseball." Eisenhower leaned forward. "Explain." "Private Eddie Kowalski and Corporal Jimmy Patterson, sir. They were manning a checkpoint when a jeep approached with 3 men in U.S. uniforms. Everything checked out, passwords, paperwork, unit insignia. But something felt off to them. So Patterson asked who won the World Series. The Germans didn't know. When they tried to run, our boys shot them." "And we're certain they were Germans?" "Absolutely, sir. German identification discs under their dog tags, Wehrmacht paybooks. And one of them," Dixon consulted his notes, "had a detailed map of our fuel depots and ammunition dumps. These weren't just soldiers. They were Skorzeny's commandos." The name landed like a bomb. Everyone in the room knew Otto Skorzeny, knew what he'd done to Mussolini's guards, knew his reputation for the impossible. "How many are out there?" Eisenhower asked. "Unknown, sir. Could be dozens. Could be hundreds. Every roadblock is reporting suspicious behavior. Tires shot out on jeeps, wrong answers to challenges. But here's the problem," Dixon grimaced. "We're also shooting our own guys. Yesterday alone, we detained 3 generals because their drivers couldn't answer questions about Mickey Mouse. General Bruce Clark was held at gunpoint for 30 minutes because he said the Chicago Cubs play in the American League. General Bradley was stopped 5 times in one day." Someone at the table, a young major whose name Eisenhower would never remember, laughed nervously. "Jesus, we're going to lose this war because nobody knows baseball." "No," Eisenhower said slowly, his mind already working. "We're going to win this war because of it." December 19th, 1944. Checkpoint, outside Bastogne. By the 3rd day of the offensive, the trivia war had gone into full effect. At every roadblock, bridge, and crossroads between the German lines and Paris, American soldiers had transformed themselves into the world's most heavily armed game show hosts. Corporal Mike Quizmaster Delgado had made it into an art form. Standing at his checkpoint with a cup of coffee in one hand and his M1 carbine in the other, he'd created what he called the American Test, a series of questions so specifically absurdly American that no amount of training could prepare a German for them. A jeep approached and Delgado raised his hand. "Hold up there, boys. Where you coming from?" "3rd Battalion, 4 miles east," the driver called back. He was young, maybe 20, with a Kentucky accent you could cut with a knife. Password? Brooklyn. Countersign? Dodgers. Perfect. But Delgado had learned not to trust perfect. Okay, soldier, quick question. Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? The driver didn't even blink. Minnie Mouse, Corporal. And don't try to trick me with Donald's nephews. They're Huey, Dewey, and Louie. Delgado grinned. You're good. One more. What's the capital of Illinois? Springfield, not Chicago, even though everybody thinks it's Chicago. Why not Chicago? Because Springfield's in the center of the state, Corporal. Geography. Delgado waved them through. That was the key, not just the right answer, but the way it was delivered. Real Americans didn't just know these things. They had opinions about them. They'd argue about whether Joe DiMaggio was better than Ted Williams. They'd get defensive about their home states. They'd throw in extra information you didn't ask for, because talking was what Americans did. Germans, no matter how well trained, couldn't fake that. They could memorize facts, but they couldn't reproduce the casual arrogance of a nation raised on baseball, comic books, and Hollywood movies. 20 minutes later, another jeep approached. 3 men, perfect uniforms, perfect expressions of tired boredom that every GI wore like a uniform of its own. Password? Delgado called. Brooklyn? Countersign. Dodgers. What's the capital of Illinois? Chicago, the driver answered confidently. Delgado's carbine came up. Wrong. Hands where I can see them. Nice and slow. Wait, I meant Springfield. Springfield. I swear I just... But Delgado wasn't listening anymore. He was watching the way the passenger's hand had moved toward his Thompson, the professional speed of it, the way the tech sergeant in back had already mapped out the firing angles with his eyes. These were soldiers, good soldiers, just not his soldiers. Step out of the vehicle, now. The interrogation that followed revealed they were part of Skorzeny's elite Einheitssteilau, specialists who'd spent 8 months preparing for this mission. They spoke English so flawlessly they could switch between regional accents mid-sentence. They knew American sports, American geography, American culture down to the most minute details. But they didn't know it in their bones. They couldn't explain why Chicago wasn't the capital, only that it wasn't. They couldn't tell you what hot dogs tasted like at a baseball game, or why everyone hated the Yankees, or how it felt to listen to Bob Hope on the radio. They had information, but they didn't have experience. They had knowledge, but they didn't have life. And in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, that difference meant everything. December 22nd, 1944, German lines east of Bastogne. Otto Skorzeny crushed the report in his fist, his scarred face darker than the winter sky. Operation Greif was disintegrating. Of his 150 commandos, 44 had been captured or killed. Another 30 were trapped behind Allied lines, unable to move without triggering the American trivia gauntlet. The rest had been forced to withdraw, their mission compromised, their advantage lost. Baseball, he spat. Baseball and cartoons and state capitals. We trained them for 8 months. 8 months. Every accent, every gesture, every idiom. And they're being caught because they don't know which mouse is married to which other mouse. His second in command, Hauptmann Karl Radl, stood at attention, wisely saying nothing. What was there to say? They'd anticipated everything. Codes, checkpoints, documents, even the possibility of being questioned about American culture. But they'd treated culture like information, something that could be downloaded into a soldier's brain like ammunition into a magazine. They'd been wrong. The Americans had turned culture into a weapon, and not just any weapon. They'd weaponized the very casualness of their civilization, the throwaway knowledge that every kid absorbed growing up. Skorzeny's men could discuss American history and geography with the precision of scholars, but they couldn't tell you what kind of candy kids bought at corner stores, or what songs played on jukeboxes, or why the Brooklyn Dodgers inspired such passionate hatred in anyone who wasn't from Brooklyn. They're using trivia as passwords, Radl ventured carefully. Random questions with no set answers. It's brilliant, really. Impossible to defeat with training. It's more than that, Skorzeny admitted, his tactical mind forcing him to acknowledge the elegance of the American response, even as it infuriated him. They've made every soldier into a verification system. No documents can be forged, no code can be broken, because the code is being American, and you either are or you aren't. He looked out at the frozen landscape, where American and German forces were locked in one of the war's bloodiest battles. Bastogne was still holding, the offensive was stalling, and his commandos, the elite tip of the spear that was supposed to create chaos and confusion, had been neutralized not by superior tactics or overwhelming force, but by questions about baseball. "Recall everyone still operational," he ordered. "Operation Greif is terminated." "Yes, sir, and the men already captured." Skorzeny's face hardened. "They're dead men. The Americans will execute them as spies. They knew the risks." It was true. Wearing enemy uniforms was a clear violation of the laws of war. 18 of his commandos would eventually face firing squads, dying with the same courage they'd shown in training. But their deaths would accomplish nothing. The mission had failed. Not because the Americans were better soldiers, not because German planning was flawed, but because war had changed, and Skorzeny, brilliant, audacious, dangerous Skorzeny, had failed to understand how. December 26, 1944, POW Interrogation Center, Reims, France. Oberleutnant Gunther Schultz sat across from Captain Morris Maury Goldstein, U.S. Army Intelligence, and tried to comprehend how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. 6 days ago, he'd been invincible, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now he was a prisoner awaiting execution, and the thing that bothered him most wasn't the firing squad he knew was coming. It was the sheer stupidity of how he'd been caught. "You want to know what gave you away?" Goldstein asked, lighting a cigarette and pushing the pack across the table. Schultz took one, grateful for the gesture, even though he knew it was calculated. Everything these Americans did was calculated, just not in ways he'd been trained to recognize. "The baseball question?" Schultz guessed. "Nah, you got that one right. Barely. It was the way you held your knife at breakfast." Schultz blinked. "My knife?" "European style. Fork in the left hand, knife in the right, tines down. You never switched like Americans do. We cut our food, put down the knife, switch the fork to the right hand, and eat. Inefficient as hell, but that's how we grow up. You knew every player on every team, but you held your utensils wrong." The irony was devastating. Months of preparation, thousands of details memorized, and he'd been undone by table manners he'd learned as a child. "There's something I don't understand," Schultz said. "This culture weapon of yours, this trivia, these questions about cartoons and sports, it only works because your entire nation shares the same references. Every American knows Mickey Mouse. Every American has opinions about baseball. How is that possible? Germany is cultured. We have Goethe and Beethoven and centuries of civilization. But we don't have anything like your common knowledge." Goldstein studied him for a long moment, and Schultz saw something unexpected in the intelligence officer's eyes. Not triumph, but thoughtfulness. "You want the truth? It's because we're not ancient. We don't have centuries of civilization. What we have is movies and radio and newspapers and baseball cards and comic books. Cheap mass media that every kid in America consumes like oxygen. It's not deep. It's not sophisticated. But it's shared. A kid in Montana knows the same cartoons as a kid in Georgia. They listen to the same radio shows, watch the same movies, collect the same baseball cards. We built a culture of surfaces, Schultz, and you can't fake a surface. You either know it or you don't." "So we lost because we're too educated," Schultz said bitterly. "No. You lost because you thought culture was something you could learn. But culture isn't information. It's experience. It's memory. It's 1,000 stupid little things you absorb growing up. Things so trivial you don't even know you know them until someone asks. And that," Goldstein stubbed out his cigarette, "that's something no spy school can teach." January 7th, 1945. checkpoint outside Malmedy, Belgium. Eddie Kowalski stamped his feet against the cold and accepted another cup of terrible coffee from Southpaw Patterson. The Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. The German offensive had been blunted, then reversed. Thousands had died on both sides, and the Ardennes would be remembered as one of the war's bloodiest engagements. But for Kowalski, who'd spend the rest of his life telling the story at Southside Chicago taverns, the victory wasn't about tanks or artillery or air support. It was about the moment he'd asked 3 German commandos who won the World Series and watched their perfect English dissolve into confusion. "Think Skorzeny's still out there?" Patterson asked, nodding toward the German lines. "Probably. Guy like that doesn't quit easy." "Think he learned his lesson?" Kowalski shrugged. "What lesson? That we're better spies than they are? That's not it. We're not better spies. We're just American. And you can't fake that." Patterson pulled out a pack of baseball cards he'd received in the latest package from home, opening them with the reverence some men reserve for holy texts. "Ted Williams, batting .327. Nice. Hey, Eddie, you think Williams is better than DiMaggio?" "DiMaggio, no contest." "You're insane. Williams was hitting," and just like that, they were arguing about baseball at a frozen checkpoint in Belgium, their rifles propped against sandbags, their breath steaming in the winter air. 2 American kids doing what American kids did, having absolutely no respect for proper European dignity and propriety, secure in the knowledge that their casual, commercial, mass-produced culture had just won them a battle that textbooks and training manuals never could have. Behind them, another jeep approached the checkpoint. The driver called out the password. Kowalski waved him forward, then raised his hand. "Hold up. Quick question. What's Porky Pig's girlfriend's name?" "Petunia, Corporal." "Now can I please get through? I've been asked that question at 8 different checkpoints today." "Go ahead. But just so you know, I think you're wrong about Williams." "How do you know what I think about Williams?" "Because everyone's wrong about Williams." The jeep rolled through, and somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like thunder. But at this checkpoint, at this moment, the war was about baseball, cartoons, and the strange, shallow, powerful culture of a nation that had turned trivia into triumph. Epilogue: The Lessons of the Bulge. The military historians would write their volumes about the Battle of the Bulge, analyzing tank formations and supply lines and strategic objectives with the precision such things deserved. They would note that Otto Skorzeny's Operation Greif failed to achieve its objectives, that the German offensive stalled and reversed, that the Third Reich's last great gamble had failed. But they would largely miss the profound revolution that happened at those frozen checkpoints, where the nature of warfare itself changed in ways that would echo through the decades to come. Intelligence services worldwide studied the lesson. Traditional espionage, the memorization of facts, the mastery of languages, the perfection of documents, was no longer sufficient. In an age of mass media and shared culture, the deepest cover wasn't forged papers, but authentic experience. You couldn't train someone to be American any more than you could train them to have grown up in the Bronx or watched cartoons on Saturday mornings or learned to love baseball from their father. The Cold War would be fought in part on these terms. Soviet spies would spend years living in American suburbs, raising American children, absorbing American culture not through study, but through life. The game of espionage became less about intelligence and more about authenticity, less about what you knew and more about who you fundamentally were. But the deeper lesson, the one that transcended military tactics, was about identity itself. In that frozen December, American soldiers discovered that their identity wasn't just about documents or citizenship or even belief in democracy. It was about Mickey Mouse and baseball and knowing that Springfield was the capital of Illinois, even though everybody thought it was Chicago. It was about shared surfaces, common references, trivial knowledge that bonded 130 million people into something that looked shallow from the outside, but ran deeper than any German commando could penetrate. Otto Skorzeny, who survived the war and lived until 1975, never wrote about Operation Greif in his memoirs. Perhaps the failure cut too deep, perhaps he never fully understood it, or perhaps he understood it perfectly and recognized that he'd encountered something more powerful than tanks or tactics, a form of cultural identity so pervasive, so thoroughly absorbed that it couldn't be faked or forged or infiltrated. Eddie Kowalski returned to Chicago after the war, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 kids, and spent 40 years working for the Department of Sanitation. Every December 16th, he'd sit in Kowalski's Tavern on Ashland Avenue, his cousin's place, not his, order a shot and a beer, and tell anyone who'd listen about the time he defeated Hitler's elite commandos by asking who won the World Series. Most people thought he was exaggerating. A few thought he was lying. But the ones who'd been there, the other GIs who'd manned checkpoints and asked about cartoons and baseball, they knew. They'd participated in a form of warfare that no military academy could have predicted and no training manual could replicate. They'd won a battle with trivia, defended their lines with pop culture, and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't in an armory, but in the accumulated debris of growing up American, knowing which mouse married which team won which series, and why Chicago, despite being bigger and more famous, will never be the capital of Illinois. It was shallow, it was commercial, it was mass-produced and distributed and consumed without thought or reflection. And it was, in that frozen December of 1944, exactly what was needed to stop 3 German commandos from rolling through a checkpoint and changing the course of the war. Because in the end, Otto Skorzeny had prepared his men for everything except the reality of America itself. Not the America of history books and propaganda, but the real, living, breathing America of baseball cards and radio shows and 10-cent comic books. The America that existed not in ideas, but in the automatic knowledge every kid absorbed while growing up. The culture that couldn't be faked because it wasn't meant to be important. Until the day it was the most important thing in the world. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces in full retreat. Of Otto Skorzeny's 150 commandos deployed in Operation Greif, 18 were executed as spies, 44 were captured, and the rest withdrew. The operation is remembered as a brilliant concept defeated by an even more brilliant improvisation, the weaponization of culture itself. The trivia-based checkpoint system remained in use throughout the European theater for the remainder of the war, evolving into increasingly sophisticated tests of American cultural knowledge. After the war, the technique was studied by intelligence agencies worldwide and influenced interrogation and verification procedures for decades. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski and Corporal Jimmy Patterson both survived the war. Kowalski received a commendation for his actions at Malmedy. Patterson returned to Alabama, took over his family's general store, and never stopped arguing about baseball. When asked years later about stopping Skorzeny's commandos, he said simply, "Hell, anybody who can't name the Cardinals over the Browns doesn't deserve to wear an American uniform, even a fake one." And in that sentiment, casual, profane, and absolute, lies the entire story of how pop culture defeated the Third Reich's most dangerous commando.